didn't record correctly. I couldn't find the link anywhere, so I'm just going to hurry up and go ahead and record a second time and try and get through this again. So welcome those of you who didn't make it to my Sunday at 10 a.m. Presentation. My name is Robert Harrison, and I will be summarizing Chapter 20 of our text, Clinical and Organizational Applications of Applied Behavior Analysis. And Chapter 20 is entitled Clinical Application of Behavior Analytic Social Work Practice. So here we go. An overview of the student objectives and BACB task list relevancy are as follows. There are two student objectives. The first, students will be able to identify common aspects of the disciplines of social work and behavior analysis. Second objective is that students will be able to identify areas that can be improved in order to achieve a successful multimodal approach to behavior change. Some of the items on the BACB task list that I thought were relevant to this chapter are as follows. Item E01, the use of interventions based on manipulation of antecedents, such as motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. You'll see that in this chapter they emphasize the person and environment, so I felt that this was an appropriate item for this chapter. The second is G01, and that states that we review records and available data at the outset of the case. There are phases of clinical intervention that are identified throughout this chapter, and one of which relates very much to this item of the task list. And then the final item that I decided to put on here was H01, and that is that we select a measurement system to obtain representative data given the dimensions of the behavior and the logistics of observing and recording. This chapter emphasizes the use of data-informed treatment and measures as well, so I felt that this was a very relevant item as well. Now, it's important to identify commonalities between the two disciplines of ABA and social work. First off, they share some common value systems that can be built upon for interdisciplinary practice. These include the focus of each discipline on the person in the environment, as I mentioned earlier, individualized assessment and treatment methods, and the emphasis on socially relevant problem behaviors. Next, social work is beginning to incorporate more evidence-based practices. The Behavior Analysis Services Program, BASP, is an example that this chapter provides of a statewide training program in Florida that provides behavioral parent training to foster parents and caregivers of dependent children. Project 12 Ways is a similar program that they use as an example, which is beginning to incorporate behavior principles. This chapter also identifies some special interest groups within the Association for Behavior Analysis International that are dedicated to enhancing social responsibility, as well as efforts from the National Association of Social Workers to implement evidence-based practices in social work training. So both of these special interest groups can kind of help bridge the gap between the two disciplines as well. Finally, the Ethical Code of Conduct for both social workers and behavior analysis requires use of the most effective treatment options in the least restrictive ways. So it's important to expose interdisciplinary myths. We are all familiar with the misrepresentation of applied behavior analysis, and there are similar misrepresentations in the field of social work. For example, clinical social work is perceived to have little experimental control, perceived to be subjective data collection techniques, and we're familiar with the opinions about behavior analysis, again, that we ignore client feelings or maybe have methods that are inappropriate for social advocacy and activism. A theme throughout this chapter is the emphasis that behavior analysis places on quantitative measures of behavior and the emphasis that social work places on qualitative measures of behavior. Some examples are provided later on in this presentation of qualitative measures as used by social work clinicians, and while behavior analysis views these methods as unreliable on their own, qualitative measures can be valuable for maladaptive behaviors such as suicide rumination, and they're definitely valuable when used in combination with other quantitative methods and observational methods, which will be emphasized later in this chapter. So this chapter presents a model that highlights overarching themes of treatment from start to finish. It's suggested that as a model for general guidelines related to the use of interdisciplinary behavior analytics social work practice. So the first phase is referral and relationship building. This can include informed consent, agreements on treatment, cancellation policies, payment rates, etc. In this phase, presenting problems are also discussed across a range of settings in regards to frequency, duration, and intensity. The second phase is assessment and treatment planning. During this phase, the clinician defines target behaviors for treatment and may provide a diagnosis if appropriate. They also explore functional relationships between the target behaviors and relevant environmental factors. At this time, antecedents and consequences that involve the target behavior are identified. Testing or direct manipulation of environmental events can be used for a functional assessment, and this information can be used to develop a clinical hypothesis as well as treatment goals and objectives. The third phase is treatment implementation. At this point, the clinician and the client work together to develop more adaptive behaviors. Regardless of the specific program used, the intervention should be specifically tailored from the information gathered in the first two phases of this model. Frequent data assessment and monitoring should continue throughout this phase to ensure that decisions are data informed. The duration of this phase should also be specifically tailored to the individual receiving services, with the goal of eventually fading and terminating services. So that leads us to the final phase that is suggested in this model, and that's termination. This should evolve from the treatment phase, and the clinician and the client should make decisions together in regards to the end of treatment. This time, the client should be reassessed on measures of data collection that were completed during the referral phase. So after they suggest these phases of intervention, they provide some case examples in order to kind of use real-life examples of how to implement these phases. So the goal of these case presentations is to demonstrate how to combine behavior analysis and social work into an interdisciplinary model for mental health professional practices. And as you can see here, the findings from a lady named Susan, they've obviously changed her name, from her baseline psychological functioning assessment in phase 1, and then from functional assessment and treatment planning in phase 2. Now, in phase 1, they obviously identified Susan's social history, family history, and demographics. She referred herself to treatment because she had gambled away all of her life savings, her home, and her grandchildren's college funds. Within the 60 days prior to intake, Susan gambled around 45 to 50 of those days. She had wagered $5,000 as well. In phase 2, Susan completed gambling assessments to measure proclivity towards gambling. I have labeled the gambling assessments here, and I can explain them later on when we discuss the reliable and valid use of measurements. So these are some gambling assessments that were used, and they identified proclivity towards gambling, severity of gambling, and potential factors maintaining the gambling behaviors. We have one other case presentation that is used as an example, and that is Barry. And they provided also a 60-day retrospective baseline for the 60 days prior to intake, and Barry reported feeling extremely depressed. He reports experiences of intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, heavy drinking, and only sleeping about 2 to 3 hours at a time. As you can see on the slide, he also has taken measurements for PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms. The measurements will be identified later on. So the main focus of this chapter, after discussing the phases and giving some examples of case presentations, is the fundamental features of interdisciplinary clinical practice. They continue to use Barry and Susan as examples as they identify these 5 fundamental features. So through the use of indirect psychometric measures that are considered with high reliability, they were able to find that Barry and Susan both presented with specific behavior of concern. Susan had gambling as the behavior of concern, and Barry had insomnia as the behavior of concern. So in this first important factor, when they're identifying target behaviors, they were also able to come up with comorbid mental health diagnoses, and they emphasized that secondary target behaviors should be created to create a balance between the overt and covert behaviors that are identified through the qualitative and quantitative measures. This is another suggestion that they make to bridge the gap between those questionnaires and those direct observations that the two respective practices or disciplines tend to utilize. And then they emphasize that these all should be combined with client input in order to individualize target behaviors. You see some possible ranges of target behaviors for Susan in regards to gambling behaviors, and for Barry there in regards to PTSD or depression symptoms. Now, the second important factor of interdisciplinary clinical practice is the use of reliable and valid measurement. As I mentioned, they used a number of measurement scales for their respective behaviors and target behaviors that were identified. Susan used the South Oaks Gambling Scale, which I'm not going to give you guys all the details in order to save you time because my presentation on Collaborate went over by quite a bit. But again, that measured proclivity towards gambling. She used the Gambling Severity Assessment Scale, which basically measures severity of gambling behaviors, and then the Gambling Functional Assessment Scale 2, and that identifies maintaining variables of gambling. All of these assessments are said to have good construct and internal validity, and they are considered to be very reliable. Barry was assessed using a post-traumatic stress disorder checklist. That's the PCL. He's the military version, and he also that obviously measured PTSD symptoms. He also used the Personal Health Questionnaire 9 in order to measure depressive symptoms. And similar, both of these items are said to have very strong reliability and retestability. So we know that behavior analysis relies on direct observational methods in the applied setting. So inter-observer agreement and procedural reliability are important to assess validity and reliability in this setting. The text gives us examples of simulating computerized slot machines for Susan and exposure therapy for Barry in order to make observations. When creating an interdisciplinary approach, both of these types of measures are necessary, as is stressed throughout this chapter. So the next important factor of interdisciplinary clinical practice is the relationship between target behaviors, measures, and treatment. And this basically explains how the use of reliable measures, self-report from patients, as well as structured interviews, can lead to more accurate identification of target behaviors. This can inform the appropriate treatment interventions, and research indicates, they give examples in this chapter, that research indicates that exposure therapy is an appropriate intervention for both Susan and Barry, given their escape-maintained maladaptive behaviors that were identified and verified. The next important factor of interdisciplinary clinical practice is data-based treatment decisions. And this, obviously, if we're having data-based treatment decisions, then this can answer all types of clinically relevant questions, such as, is the treatment working? When should I target a different problem behavior? Do I need to change what I'm doing? How do I know when to terminate treatment? The relationship between, for example, Barry's target behaviors to environmental events should be identified across various response topographies in order to assist data collection across response classes. If depression and PTSD are categorized as response classes that Barry is trying to suppress, then functionally equivalent behaviors such as suicidality, depression, and insomnia could naturally occur.